Morning, everybody. You're very welcome to our Signpost Series webinar this morning. My name is Andy Boland, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so as we talk through another issue of farming and the environment. This morning, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Edward Straw from Trinity College Dublin. And Edward is going to be talking to us about the impacts of pesticides on the environment. Edward, good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And I'm also joined by Michael Hennessy. Michael is our head of crops and knowledge transfer department in Teagasc, and Michael is going to keep an eye on the questions and hopefully lead the debate and facilitate the debate that we will have after Edward's presentation. So Michael, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Andy. Looking forward to it.
Edward, you might begin by just maybe telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that you have done to date in this area.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Trinity College, which means I'm just one of the scientists there. I mostly work on the impacts of pesticides on bumblebee health. So I look at how herbicides and fungicides impact the buff-tailed bumblebee and what routes of exposure and what ways in which the pesticides can potentially hurt the bees. I mostly look at the minor ingredients in pesticides, so things like adjuvants and carriers, rather than the active ingredients. And over the last year or so, I've also been working on the Protect project, and that's the research I'm going to be talking to you about today.
Lovely. So you might, if you wouldn't mind, begin sharing your presentation with us and begin your presentation. And could I encourage as many of you as possible to engage with the Q&A tab at the bottom and put in as many questions as you want during Edward's presentation. Thanks, Edward. We can see your screen.
You can see my screen? Okay, great. I will get going then. Thank you very much. Yeah, great. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the impacts of pesticides on the environment. We're going to be talking about what the science says on this topic, coming from the perspective of sort of academic university scientists here. I'm also going to be talking about the Protect project, which is where we got the funding to do this research for. So starting off with the Protect project itself, it is a 4-year study that has been run as a collaboration between 4 separate universities, DCU, Maynooth, Trinity, and UCD, alongside Teagasc and DAFM. And initially, we wanted to look at how we could reduce the impacts of pesticides on bees and soils. But actually, when we started to think about that, we said, hang on a second, we don't really know enough about the impacts of pesticides on bees and soils. So let's actually do some of that like baseline research. Let's actually look at the base level and say, can we develop more scientific knowledge on this topic before we go ahead and start making recommendations? So that would allow us to make more informed and deliberate recommendations based on actual real scientific evidence rather than just common sense or assumptions. So today we're going to be talking about a series of topics. First of all, we'll just cover why bees and soils are important and what value they have to us, both in farming and the wider ecosystem. Then we'll talk about what threats are facing bees. That's a lot of discussion in the press. So we'll cover the actual science behind that. Then we'll move on to talking about how much we know about herbicides and fungicides and how they impact bees. Then we'll talk about some of the research that we've done on the Protect project about contamination of flowers with glyphosate and what glyphosate is. Then we'll close off by talking about the diversity of pesticide products that are on sale, both to farmers and to amateur users, households and the like. So beginning with bees and soils, bees, there's the general assumption that they're very important, and that assumption is true. Within Ireland, there's about 100 species of bee, 1 species of honeybee, something like 20 species of bumblebee, and then the rest of the species are solitary bees. Across the globe, 75% of all different types of crop are pollinated by bees, which means they're incredibly important in agricultural ecosystems. And then something like 90% of all wild plants are pollinated by bees. Now, it's not to say that particularly within Ireland, all agriculture is reliant on bees. Grass, wheat, barley, they're not pollinated by bees, they're pollinated by the wind. But bees, even within Ireland, are incredibly important in protecting our ecosystem more broadly and keeping sort of the broader ecosystem, so the wildflowers and trees and stuff like that, healthy and functioning. And it's not necessarily just the amount of food that bees contribute to producing, it's also the quality of the food. So if you look at some like vitamins, like vitamin C, around 90% of the vitamin C that we as the human race consume comes from crops that have to be bee pollinated. So actually without bees, we would be very, very deficient in certain nutrients. Moving on to soils then, soils, they're the absolute foundation of agriculture. Without healthy quality soils, you really can't just produce the volume of food that we need to sustain 8 billion people. Soils are also really important in the recycling of nutrients and regulation of the climate. They lock up a lot of carbon and help us achieve sort of the carbon climate goals that we are aiming for there. I'm mostly going to be talking about bees simply because that's where my area of expertise is, but we will touch on soils a little bit. So when we talk about bees, the narrative is that all the bees are dying and that's terrible, and that pesticides are the cause behind all of that. And it is true that bees are suffering population declines right across the globe. It's less severe than some of the rhetoric would lead you to believe, but there is still good evidence that we are having bee declines within Europe in particular. But the real science says that the main reason that we've seen these historical levels of declines is actually just because of changes in how we use land. It's not necessarily pesticides that are the main cause driving this. It's the fact that, say, within Europe, we've lost something like 95% of the wildflower meadows. So that's like prime habitat for bees that we've just simply kind of removed. So historically, it's mostly land use changes that are driving the declines in bee populations. And then following on from that, another stressor that bees are facing is pesticides. We do know that some pesticides have, real impacts on bees' health. And we do know from good studies, good field studies, big, well-replicated stuff, that some pesticides are driving sort of damage to bee populations at a landscape level. Finally, of the human-led stresses that the bees have, the things that are stressing bees out, climate change is another one that's coming up. As we see increasing weather patterns that are confusing for bees, that mess with their hibernation cycles and their foraging cycles. And additionally, we see increasing amounts of invasive species, invasive parasites, and invasive predators coming in and sort of messing with the bees' general ecosystem and how they function. So of those three threats there, we're trying to do what we can on climate change. We can't really do that much about how we use land just because there's too many people knocking about. Pesticides is something that we can tangibly do, but again, pesticides are very important for modern agriculture. So we need to look at how we address pesticide use to make it better for bees while still protecting pesticides and preventing, us leading to mass starvation. So when we were thinking about protecting bees from pesticides, we initially thought about insecticides. We know that some insecticides can harm bees. But we wanted to look at where there wasn't good evidence already. And we were thinking about it and we were thinking, there's actually quite a lot of research on the impacts of insecticides on bees. What about the other types of pesticides? What about herbicides, so weed killers or fungicides? How do they impact bees? And really, when we were looking out there at the literature, we realized that there was very little going on there. There was very little that we had knowledge of there. So we wanted to quantify that scientifically. So we conducted a systematic review, which means that we scanned all of the scientific literature with a very rigorous methodology. And we counted every single paper that tested the impacts of a herbicide or a fungicide on bees specifically. What we found was that for herbicides, there was really very little research whatsoever. So glyphosate, the most widely used pesticide in sort of ever, there was only 15 studies done on the impacts of glyphosate on bees. And then for the next top 5, we're talking single-digit numbers of studies. So there's a really low level of research going on there for herbicides, given herbicides are also very widely used. The story for fungicides is a little bit better. At least the top 5 are all double-digit numbers of studies going on here. So propiconazole, one of the most widely used pesticides in Ireland, that at least had 15 studies done on it. Unfortunately, though, a lot of these studies are done in terms of how the fungicide interacts with insecticides to harm bees, whereas they're not specifically having fungicides as the main topic there. So actually, the level of research that we have for fungicides isn't as great as these numbers would lead you to believe. when we compare this through to, say, insecticides, if you sum up every single piece of research that's been done on herbicides and fungicides combined, it's probably less research that's been done on one single neonicotinoid. So really, in comparison to the insecticide literature, we know almost nothing about this. So for the majority of the talk today, we're going to be talking about glyphosate. It's one of the main substances that we worked on within the PROTECT project. It was a really good one for us to study and to choose to study simply because it's very widely used within Ireland and it's very widely used in modern agriculture. Glyphosate is an important substance in modern agriculture because it allows sort of low-till or no-till farming, and that's very important in terms of regulating the climate and preventing massive amounts of soil erosion. Glyphosate is a weed killer, so it's a herbicide. It's designed to target sort of weed species within a crop, and it's very, very important in that. It can be bought by both farmers in formulations like, say, Roundup Pro Bio or Gallup formulations and the like there, but it can also be bought by consumers in Dunn's or Tesco in formulations like Roundup Ready to Use. So we looked at how much glyphosate was used within Irish ecosystems, and we said, what are the impacts of this on bees? Could bees be exposed to this herbicide? And one of the things that we found was that residues of glyphosate can actually spread further than we would expect them to within a field. So we found that when glyphosate was used as a desiccant in oilseed rape crops, and when we say a desiccant in oilseed rape crops, what we mean there is that when an oilseed rape crop has the seed pods and it's nearing ready to be harvested, farmers can spray the field with glyphosate to kill off the crop. And to make it more uniform so that you get a better harvest and it's easier to harvest, and that massively increases yield. And we found that when that crop was sprayed as a desiccant with glyphosate, following correct pesticide application guidelines, bramble flowers in the field margin 2 weeks later, so the margin around the field that weren't sprayed, we found that they actually ended up being contaminated with the pesticide, with glyphosate. So we were seeing that the residues of the pesticide product that weren't supposed to be making their way outside of the field were actually leading to contamination of the flowers that bees will be foraging on in the surrounding environment. There's a few different ways in which the pesticide could have made its way across into the bramble flowers. Spray drift is one option there. Spray drift isn't the most likely option just because farmers are pretty good at controlling spray drift. There's a lot of different things available to them to do that. Runoff is another option that could have happened, whereby the pesticide product could have pooled on the ground and then trickled out into the field margin. That's also not particularly likely because, again, farmers are pretty good at controlling runoff. The other option is root uptake. So glyphosate as a sort of water-soluble substance, a substance that can move around in soils. If there was rain and then the glyphosate leached out into the surrounding area, it could then be taken up by the bramble flower and make its way into the flowers through that. So what we were finding was that glyphosate can actually make its way into wildflowers, even though it's not sprayed on them deliberately. However, the picture isn't the same for every single type of application of glyphosate. When glyphosate was sprayed before sowing of the oilseed rape, it wasn't detected in the crop and it wasn't detected in the bramble flowers. When it was sprayed after sowing, it wasn't detected in the crop or the bramble flowers. And actually, when it was sprayed as a desiccant, it was only detected in the bramble flowers. So this isn't to say that all sprays of glyphosate leads to contamination everywhere. It's just saying that sometimes when pesticides are sprayed, you do end up with contamination of resources that the bees will be foraging on later down the line, and actually that there are unintended consequences to spraying pesticides sometimes that leads to contamination of things that bees are going to be eating. Some further research that we've done on soils that's not yet published, so I won't talk about in much detail, but we have found that actually in soil samplings that we've done, we've seen longer persistencies of pesticides in soils than we had anticipated. So we're actually seeing that the pesticides would stick about in the soils for much longer than we were hoping for. And some substances of note that were sticking around for longer were boscalid, prothioconazole, and glyphosate. And this just attests to the fact that one of the messages that we're saying here is, when you spray pesticides, we do have to acknowledge that spraying pesticide leads to contamination within the wider ecosystem. That doesn't mean don't spray the pesticide. It just means let's consider for a second, is there an alternative to spraying the pesticide? Or then acknowledge that if we are going to be spraying that pesticide, what are the consequences of that? How is that going to spread out in the environment? And is the cost of spraying the pesticide worth the benefit that we derive from it? Now, one of the things that we heard from people when we're talking about glyphosate and bees is actually, it's not particularly important. You don't need to worry about it, simply because glyphosate kills plants, right? So if you spray a plant like a weed, and the plant then dies, the bees aren't going to be able to forage on it, so they're not going to be exposed to it. We kind of intuitively knew that this wasn't strictly right, simply because we'd seen residues of glyphosate in honey, we'd seen residues of glyphosate in bee collected pollen, so we knew that bees were foraging on these plants, but we wanted to demonstrate that scientifically and with some good evidence. So the first thing we did is we looked at what happens when you spray a plant with glyphosate. So this is purple tansy. It's a wildflower that we sprayed with glyphosate, and we essentially just monitored the health of the plant for the next 4 or 5 days. We found that up to 70 hours later, the latest time point that we sampled, we were still seeing contamination of the flowers that were still active and sort of like functional flowers there. They still had nectar in them, and they would still be attractive. So they were still likely to be drawing bees in. So 70 hours later, 3 days after spraying, the flowers on this plant that has been sprayed and is in the process of dying still had glyphosate in them. We then followed this up by looking at the foraging of the bees on the plants. So on this graph here, you've got 2 different treatments, unsprayed treatment, so that was just sprayed with water, and then a glyphosate treatment, which was sprayed with glyphosate and eventually died after about 5 days. And then on the vertical axis, that's just how much time the bees spent on each plant. And what we actually found was that, regardless of whether or not a plant was sprayed with glyphosate or not, within the next, 70 odd hours, bees would forage on it absolutely, without regard whatsoever. They would be perfectly happy foraging on that crop. So really what this leads us to say is that, if you spray flowering weeds with pesticides that are bee attractive, that is going to lead to bees being exposed to the pesticides. Even though the plant will die eventually, in the 3-4 days after spraying, you are going to see bee exposure to that pesticide. Again, this isn't to say don't spray pesticides because they're so important, and herbicides are so important in controlling weeds. It's just saying, if we are going to be spraying these substances, we have to acknowledge that they do have knock-on consequences and do lead to bees being exposed to them. So is there alternatives to a spray? Could mechanical control be done? Could you spray earlier in the season or later in the season when they're not flowering? It's thinking about the alternatives before jumping right into using the spray bottle. Zooming out a little bit from talking specifically about what we did on the Protect project, I think it's important to talk about the wider scientific evidence for the impacts of glyphosate on bees. It's a topic that's increasingly coming under discussion, particularly with glyphosate being up for renewal, and there being a whole host of different ways in which people are worried about glyphosate impacting human health or bee health or the wider environment, and glyphosate in bees is increasingly becoming a topic of concern. So my personal opinion on this, and I'm just presenting what I think and my synthesis of the evidence here, is that I think there is a limited amount of evidence that glyphosate can be harmful to bees. There's some very high quality studies that show that there are impacts of glyphosate on bees' health. There are also some very high quality studies that show there are not impacts of glyphosate on bee health. And that tells us that if it does have impacts, they're not universal, they are maybe context specific, they may be species specific. On top of that, there is also a lot of research that I would characterize as of lower quality scientific research that does find more large-scale impacts of glyphosate on bee health. So really, when we pull that together, we can say that there is some evidence that glyphosate can be harmful to bees, but the evidence there is conflicting at times and not massive in scale. Some of the good high-quality studies that we've seen impacts of glyphosate on bees, we do know that glyphosate can impact bees' ability to stay warm. Bees, they need to stay warm, you know, they're insects. So it can change how they regulate their body temperature and regulate the body temperature of their nests. And we also have seen that glyphosate can change the gut microbiome of honeybees. So like it changes how they process food, and that can actually have knock-on consequences for parasite prevalence and parasite defense. And actually, the glyphosate can make the bees more susceptible to parasites because it's changed their gut microbiome. However, you know, we can say that these scale of effects that we've seen, that we have evidence for, it's not on the same level as the neonicotinoids, right? Glyphosate's been used since 1974. If it was causing as much damage to bee populations as the neonicotinoids were, you know, we wouldn't have bees left because glyphosate is so widely used, right? So we can say that even if glyphosate is causing harm to bees, it's not causing the same scale of harm, it's not causing the same severity of harm as some of the other substances like neonicotinoids have been doing. However, you know, the flip side of this is that glyphosate is very, very widely used in modern agriculture. It's integral to the way that we produce food now, and if we stopped using glyphosate, we would really struggle to feed the human population. But because we use glyphosate so widely, and it's because it's so widely applied in fields in such a wide array of different circumstances, if it does cause even a small issue in bee health, you know, that scales up, that ends up becoming a broader issue simply because of how heavily used it is and how often bees will interact with it. So, you know, in conclusion there, glyphosate could potentially be bad for bees' health. We don't have enough evidence on that yet. If it is bad for bees' health, that would be a bad thing, but we do know that the level of badness it could be for bees' health isn't going to be, you know, as terrible as it could be for, say, something like the neonicotinoids. So moving on to the final topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is the diversity of pesticide products on sale within Ireland. Slightly different topic, but I thought it would be an interesting one for a farming audience because we're going to be talking not just about farming pesticide products, but also pesticide products that anyone can buy. So this is a piece of research that I did looking at the amount of pesticide products. So we're talking, you know, bottles of a pesticide that you can buy that are on sale to professional users. So those are people who have the license and the qualification to go out and spray pesticides. So we're talking farmers, contractors, horticulturalists, you know, groundskeepers, that kind of thing. And comparing that to the number of products that are on sale to household users. So, you know, those are people who don't have training and just walking into Tesco or Dunnes or garden centre and buying whatever substance they feel like there. So this graph here shows the different amounts of products on sale to these two groups. For professional users, we're talking somewhere in the region of 800 or 900 products on sale there. That's quite a lot of different pesticide products on sale, 800 or 900 different products, but they represent about 206 different active ingredients, different actives. And that's actually, this is broadly speaking a good thing. You know, more products means that you have more like use cases. You can use the right product for the right job. You have more tools available in your tool set to tackle problems. And also having more diversity of products drives down costs. It leads to cheaper pesticide products just because you have more companies competing to produce the same thing. On the household front, the fact that we have, you know, 275 pesticide products, it does lead to questions as to why we need that many products for households, right? Most people use pesticides to clear off their driveways, to clear off their patios. Do we need that many pesticides for consumers to be doing that kind of job? So if you think about a garden centre, for anyone to walk in and buy whatever they want, this is a pretty common sight there. You'll see a whole shelf with various different pesticide products, you know, Weedle, Roundup, Resolver, the generic versions, the garden centre versions, all of that. and they're just on sale in these places here. This is in a garden center, but you can also sometimes see these on sale in supermarkets, and they'll be sold directly adjacent to foodstuffs. When we think about, farmers and spraying pesticides, and we think about consumers and spraying pesticides, the rules are very different. So if there are any farmers out there in the audience, you'll know that the requirements when it comes to spraying pesticides are really, really strict. To spray a pesticide, you have to go through a 2 or 3 day training course that costs, €250. You have to subject yourself to DAFM inspections where they can come onto your farm, look at your compliance with all of these rules and regulations, and dock you your subsidies if you're not compliant. You have to wear like PPE, a full Tyvek suit, respirator, gloves, wellies, face shield, that kind of jazz. You have to keep really strict records of what you sprayed, when you sprayed, and how you sprayed it, and the rationale for spraying it. You've got to keep your pesticides in expensive big cabinets to keep them safe and away from children and away from like food and stuff like that. And you have to adopt, legally, you have to adopt some form of integrated pest management to avoid using the pesticides. If we contrast that very strong level of controls applied to farmers to what is applied to household users, to anyone who can buy this stuff, there's almost nothing that household users have to do. They don't have to store their substances in locked containers. They don't have to wear PPE. They don't have to go through any form of training. They don't have to go through any form of inspections. There's effectively no rules and requirements applied to pesticide users from the household grouping. So when we think about people using pesticides in their garden, this is kind of the scene that we expect to see. Someone's wearing shorts, maybe flip-flops, a t-shirt. They don't have gloves on, they don't have a breathing mask on, they don't have anything on. And it's the question of like, is this what we want? Is this acceptable? Why is all of this focus in terms of pesticides on farmers when we have anyone can go out there and buy substances and then use them without the level of training and oversight that we see farmers use? Particularly as the farm to fork negotiations pick up in Brussels, there's a lot of pressure on farmers to reduce their pesticide usage, but we know that farmers' pesticide usage is incredibly important in producing the level of food that we need to feed 8 billion people, but all of the focus is on the farmers. But actually, hang on a second, we have consumers using pesticides that aren't really contributing to making food, they're contributing to pretty front gardens. So should all of that pressure there be on the farmers? Okay, before I say my thank yous, I'd like to just point out that the All Island Pollinator Plan has some fantastic resources on what farms and farmlands can do to help bees and pollinators more broadly. There's evidence-backed science there. There's great sort of tangible actions that you can do to help pollinators. So that's a really good resource to find at www.pollinators.ie. And then I'd like to thank all of these wonderful people, the funding bodies, and the institutions there, and ask you guys to have some questions. Let's chat about pesticides and bees.
Thank you very much, Edward. This is obviously a very, let's say, hot topic, but it's a very, we have a huge audience this morning. We have a lot of questions coming in, so we won't, I say, get to them all. We'll try and group them together and get through as much of the questions as possible. One or two actually of the questions, Edward, have been around, can we get a copy of your presentation? So I'd just like to remind people that the presentation will be up on the Teagasc website during the week, as well as a full recording of the webinar this morning. And we also produce a podcast version of the webinar as well. So all the data will be there. People are wanting us to send you the stuff, so it'll be all up on our website. One of the first questions that came in, Edward, was it says when we say pesticides, we think of the typical herbicides, fungicides, insecticides. But with regard to the bee and other insects decline, do we know the impact of any other artificial products, such as household or industrial aerosols, detergents, cleaning products? Is there any other studies done on any other chemicals, for want of a better term, probably?
Yeah, it's a tricky one there, really. So if we go back to the stuff I showed at the start, right, with glyphosate, a very, very, very widely used substance, we have a 15 studies on how that impacts bees. So that's an incredibly widely used substance, a big use chemical, very little research. If we then think about all the other pollutants that, you know, industrial sort of complexes put out into the environment, like soot and particulates like that, or other aerosols and things like that, we really have a vanishingly small amount of evidence in terms of how they impact bees. So that there's, in some cases, there's a couple of studies on them. So we do know things like soot and carbon particulates produced by burning greenhouse gases. We do know that things like that can impact bees, but really we're talking, you know, there's like a couple of pieces of research done on this. So really we're talking a vanishingly small amount of evidence there. The scale that those chemicals are produced in is pretty large, but actually they tend to be like quite diffuse in the environment. They tend to spread out quite a lot, particularly the airborne ones. So you have very low concentrations of them, which makes them very hard to study in terms of how they impact bees, because low concentrations means that they would cause very small scale effects that you need very large studies to study. So we don't really know a crazy amount about how those substances impact bees. And actually, really, in terms of studying how chemicals impact bees, we're only now getting to the herbicides and the fungicides of the world, let alone down to the aerosols and the industrial substances.
Okay, Edward, I might just ask you to stop sharing your screen there. It might be easier,
yeah, sure,
on people looking. And just one more question there before I go to Michael. Someone else comments that every pesticide, an active substance, has an ecotoxicology data set, which sits with EU approval. Each data set includes detailed studies on acute and chronic impacts on bees. Were these data sets considered by your work?
So in terms of the studies that we did in terms of looking at how the glyphosate spreads in the environment, no, we weren't looking at the European data on that. There are some European level studies, say produced by the pesticide companies that look at the spread of this, and that they find similar sort of substances. They find similar sort of results whereby glyphosate can lead to contamination of bee crops and bee food sources. In terms of broader though than that, we do look, as scientists looking at the impacts of pesticides on bees, we do look at those European studies. You know, they are really important. They're very rigorous and well done studies, well funded. We do look at them. One of the problems that we have with using those studies is that they only mostly look at the mortality impacts of pesticides. So does this pesticide kill the bee? And actually, over the last 10 years, we've seen that the pesticide research has said, hang on a second, right? Just because a bee survives a pesticide exposure doesn't mean that that bee is healthy and happy. It actually means that like that bee could be suffering. It could have reduced ability to learn. It could have reduced ability to stay warm. It could have reduced ability to reproduce. So while we do look at and reference the sort of European level pesticide company data studies, we also say, there's massive data deficiencies there, and they're not covering a wide enough array of impacts and ways that the pesticide could harm bees.
And sorry, Mike, just before I go to you, one or two questions as well on the funding of the project. Now I see DAFM there, so I presume they were one of your funders. Who funded your research?
Yeah, so the research is funded by DAFM. So we were funded by one of the grant things that they do, which I can't remember the name of.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, we are funded by DAFM. So this is government funded research, but it's done entirely independent, without sort of like oversight by them. They don't tell us what to research, and we report our science back to them in the hopes that they will listen, and they've been good in responding to what we say and what we do. Yeah.
Michael, there's an avalanche of questions there.
There is a lot of questions, and I don't think we're going to get through them all. So we'll try and bulk them up a little bit. You picked on a very interesting topic, certainly for lots of people out there. So there's some more general ones and there's some more specific ones. Maybe in a more general one, Edward, there's a question around, is it not normal to spray plants with flowers on them? And maybe secondary to that, then you might answer the question then around, is food or is rape crops sprayed with glyphosate on a pre-harvest basis, are they 100% safe to eat?
Okay, so we've got two sets of questions there. So yeah, spraying flowers, yes, that very widely happens. So with insecticides, the majority of them can't be sprayed on flowers simply because we acknowledge that insecticides can be bad for bees. So we tend not to spray flowers, like flowers that bees would visit with insecticides. But with fungicides, for instance, if you look at strawberry crops, it's actually recommended to spray the strawberry crops during flowering, simply because that's a period in time in which they can have a high level of disease susceptibility. So then you've got a situation in which a crop is flowering, is being attractive, and is being sprayed with a fungicide. For herbicides, you spray weeds at a point in time. They don't have a set life history like crops do. They're not planted, so they kind of come and go when they do. But it is actually recommended to spray a lot of weeds during flowering, just because that's a point in time in which the weeds are very vulnerable to pesticides, because they're doing a lot of energy in terms of trying to reproduce. So actually a lot of pesticide labels for herbicides will say spray during flowering of the weeds. Moving on to the topic of safe to eat, I work on bees. Bees are very, very different to humans, but the European legislation does establish that there are a maximum residue limit. So there are maximum amounts of pesticides that can make their way into the food that humans eat. And any type of pesticide spray that is done cannot lead to those limits being exceeded. And those limits do have scientific basis behind them. And we do have studies that say that consuming levels of glyphosate, say below those thresholds, is safe. It's the same story with the bees, in that the European legislation and regulation, it does a lot of the work, but there is still data deficiencies there. And there are still other ways in which pesticides could impact humans that we may not have the full amount of research on. So, I would say pesticides might be safe to eat. I don't eat organic myself. I don't think that they're going to be causing the huge, massive, problems that we would associate with DDTs and the pesticides of the past. But I would also say that there is a likelihood that some of the substances that we work with currently may be causing human health impacts. I would mostly actually be worried about the farmers applying them, though, less so than the consumers, just because consumers eat very small amounts and farmers are applying this stuff in massive quantities on a regular basis. So I'm more worried about the farmers than I am about the consumers personally.
Okay, but there's no suggestion within this project that the oilseed rape was applied with glyphosate at the time of flowering?
No, there isn't, no.
No, okay. More specific one then, it kind of gets down to, I suppose, farmer practice. It sounds like it's coming from a farmer. Did you consider the nozzle type that was used, 75 or 90% drift reduction nozzles, when desiccating oilseed rape, which obviously has a huge impact on drift reduction? And putting surface contaminants, yeah, that one first of all.
No, we didn't. It was only one farmer that was used, so we didn't have a comparison between nozzle types. It would be an interesting one to do, and there has been a degree of research done on how nozzle type impacts or spray drift and how that impacts bees. Broadly speaking, though, that research, as is the story with most pesticide bee research, is very, very early days, and we just don't know that much about it. So in terms of protecting bees from pesticides, there are common sense things we can do, like using low drift nozzles, but we don't have the scientific evidence to say that they actually work. That doesn't mean don't do them, and it doesn't mean that they don't work. It just means we don't have the scientific evidence typically to say that they do work. So it needs more funding and it needs more research before we give the scientific backing to that idea beyond the common sense backing that it has.
So you might just expand. We're not sure from a scientific point of view that low drift nozzles work, or that bees can't be affected where low drift nozzles have been used. Yeah,
so we do know that low drift nozzles do reduce drift. The lack of scientific evidence that we have at the moment is whether or not the measures that we put in place, like low drift nozzles, actually lead to reduced bee exposure to the substances. We just don't have the link between less drift and less bee exposure. It makes common sense, but also, pesticides can make their way into the soils and then spread out through leaching and all sorts of other ways. So we don't actually know if those measures are effective yet, but common sense would suggest that they are.
Okay. There's one here around soils, because you mentioned soils earlier on, where pesticides can persist longer in soils than expected. And the question is, you did not describe objective data to support this statement. And maybe you might explain how your recommendations in terms of maybe not spraying at all, how your findings would support a hypothesis like that.
Yeah, so I did mention that that is unpublished research. So we wanted to talk about soils a little bit, but we've had a little bit of a lag in terms of the soil publications relative to the bee publications coming out. So I can't talk about specifics from that research simply because it's not published, and it wouldn't be ethical for me to be discussing that in the specific sense. I would say that we're not recommending don't spray at all. You know, we're not saying that any of our research says do not make pesticide sprays. We're just saying acknowledge that when you spray a pesticide, the residues of that pesticide will persist in the environment, they will make their way into the soils, and they will make their way into bees' environments and bees' diets. And it's saying, you know, when you spray, think, are there IPM measures I can do instead of this? You know, is there a way of avoiding pesticide sprays rather than using the pesticide as the first port of call? And that's really in line with a lot of the European guidance, and it's in line with a lot of the Chagas guidance as well, of like try and integrate more IPM into your management practices. And it's some of the scientific evidence behind that saying when you spray, there will be environmental impacts. So, you know, a little bit more care is useful.
You mentioned quite a lot there about non-farmers using pesticides, and I have a question here about how does the volume of pesticides used in agriculture compare to those used with the general public?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So farmers, when they spray a pesticide, have to record how much they sprayed, when they sprayed, where they sprayed. You know, if you buy something from Tesco and spray it, you don't have to submit anything to the government. So even in that, the new draft of regulations about pesticide data requirements, that still isn't covering consumers. So really, we don't have a comparable data set. We can't say how much pesticides are coming from farmers, how much pesticides are coming from consumers. Common sense would say that farmers are using vastly more pesticides simply because, you know, it's sprayed on fields multiple times a year. There's way more farms than there are gardens. It's going to be an order of magnitude more for the farmers versus the consumers simply because of the scales of what's going on here. But the lack of emphasis on consumers using pesticides is so great that we really just don't have good data on how much pesticides consumers are using.
And just on that, Edward, there's a similar question there. You know, do you think, or is there any proposal for, you know, more regulation on the consumer as opposed to the commercial user?
There really isn't much discussion of this legislatively. Even if you look at the farm to fork discussion there, they're really not thinking that consumers are a problem at all. If you look at the National Action Plan for Ireland, consumers are basically just glossed over as saying, oh, it's a minor use, it doesn't really matter. But actually, like, we should be thinking about this. And this is a topic that environmentalists and farmers could kind of get together on. You know, normally you've got environmentalists and farmers at loggerheads saying ban or don't ban. Whereas in this situation, we can say, actually, everyone can acknowledge that farmers using pesticides leads to more food, consumers using pesticides leads to prettier gardens, and also probably contamination of themselves and their environments. So maybe in this situation, we could see some coordinated action and some targeted legislation to maybe reduce the number of pesticides consumers can use, to change the types of pesticides that could be licensed. You know, maybe we could have fewer pesticides licensed, different ingredients, so that we can make sure they're safe, so that we can make sure that they're used better. So it's an area in which we could see some good legislation, definitely.
Yeah, even with an education role. I mean, it's amazing with most of our regulation and legislation comes from Brussels. It's amazing that nothing like that has come, you know, even outside of agriculture. There's just one other quick question there. Relating to peat size, did you do any work, or is there a difference between mineral soils and peat soils, or in the
no, I'm sorry, I'm going to tap out there. I'm a bee scientist. I can't handle that one. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Andy, it's just worth, and Edward, it's just worth just go back on that one a little bit. There is a lot of regulations probably coming, and the Sustainable Use Directive is going to be transposed or replaced, I suppose, by Sustainable Use Regulation rather than Directive. So there's an awful lot more that farmers and maybe everybody else will have to do. So I just thought I'd say that in passing.
Yeah.
I have an interesting one here coming from, because glyphosate is used in lots of different places, and including on the use of noxious weeds. And there's a comment here from somebody towards Connemara, who's using it to control rhododendron, using it with a handheld injection method to try and control rhododendron, and they are expressing their concern about potential seepage into water maybe after that. And would you have any information around that? And there is a comment that this person would be interested in having a look at that as regards to your project.
Yeah. So anytime that you apply a pesticide, it will in some which way make its way into the broader environment, right? That's particularly true with a spray, just because when you spray something, such a small amount of it actually physically ends up where you want it to be. If you're thinking about injecting something directly into the pest, like the rhododendron that you're talking about, that is as targeted as a pesticide application is going to get. You're not spraying anything, you're directly attacking the single thing that you are trying to kill. So in terms of IPM and all of that, that is about as good as you can get. You can't do a more targeted attack than that. So I would say, as long as you're wearing your PPE when you're spraying it and you're doing it following what the label says, that's probably fine, right? There's not much more that you can do, and we do need to control invasive species like rhododendrons and Japanese knotweeds. So I would say in that situation, probably pretty good actually. I would say don't really worry about that. You'll be all right.
Okay, we have a comment here, which is useful maybe in the overall context as we're talking about farmers and non-farmers. I'm not sure how true it is. Maybe you can correct it if it's wrong. 50% of glyphosate is used for immunity purposes, according to an NUI research. 50%
of glyphosate. I can't say specifically that is wrong by saying I read a data set that says that's wrong. I'm just going to go out and say that that's not right though. It just seems vastly unlikely to be true, given there's so many grasslands in Ireland and that herbicides are used so widely in grasslands. It just doesn't sound like it would even be close to being true.
One other question, Edward, is there any knowledge of individual bee species having or developing a resistance to pesticides?
Well, so you've got like resistance management programs for stopping pest species being resistant to herbicides and fungicides and the like. If you think about the reproductive rates of these things, you think about aphids, they can go through generation after generation after generation within a year, whereas most bee species, it's one generation per year. So pests can evolve resistance so much faster than bees could evolve resistance. And actually, with the unintended consequence of the fact that we change what pesticides we use in this like never-ending cycle of we introduce a substance, then we ban it, then we introduce a new substance, there's no evidence to suggest whatsoever that bees have become resistant to pesticides. And realistically, there's no chance that they would do that unless we use the same pesticides for the next 30,000 years. It's unlikely that we will see that come into effect. It's more likely that we'll see bee populations just shrink and shrink instead of becoming resistant. It's just a very hard thing to do for them.
Okay, we have a question here, which you mentioned around the start of your talk, that carriers can be, in some cases, maybe more important than the active ingredients themselves. And just thinking about glyphosate, it had a product, tallow-amines, in it for a long time. Was the studies done including the tallow-amines, or was that after that was excluded from all glyphosate? Or maybe you might expand on the carriers and what are you thinking about those? Yeah,
I'm really grateful for this question. This is specifically what I work on. Expanding on the tallow-amines thing, back in the early 2000s and early 2010s, glyphosate products included a substance called POEA, or tallow-amines. It was found that those tallow-amines were carcinogens to humans. And actually, in the context of glyphosate being a potential carcinogen versus POEA, tallow-amines, the POEA was causing so many problems. So we banned that POEA, and we let the glyphosate continue being used. But that highlighted to us that actually carriers, or the technical term for them, co-formulants, can actually be more toxic to humans and to bees than the actual active ingredients in the mixtures. So when it comes to bees, I myself have done studies where we have found that if you spray bees with very high levels of pesticides, specifically glyphosate-based pesticides, if you just spray them with glyphosate-based pesticides that don't have, say, surfactants in the mix, so like things that change the surface tension and the way that the pesticide spreads out on the leaf, they're fine. The bees are fine, right? The glyphosate isn't hurting the bees there. If you include substances that do have surfactants in the mixture, though, those surfactants themselves can be harmful to the bees. And this is also true for fungicides. We found that some fungicides that have emulsifiers, so things that help the chemical stay mixed through, they can harm bees' guts. They can cause the bees to starve to death by damaging their guts and essentially killing parts of their guts. But the active ingredient in that mixture wasn't causing any of the toxicity. So really, it's not just about the actives, it's also about the whole product and what is included in it, what are the co-formulants, what is it sprayed with, what is the mixture that it's sprayed with, what adjuvants is it sprayed with. We have to look at this in its totality, and that's why we need more research into pesticides, because there's so little research on herbicides, there's so little research on fungicides, and there's even less research on these co-formulants, carriers, and adjuvants.
Okay.
There's a lot of questions coming in on the, if you want to, for a better term, the commercial versus private use of pesticides. And has there been any studies done on the private use of pesticides?
In terms of how they impact bees?
Yes.
No, not really.
Or even on any other that you know of or aware of?
We do know from some research from Bristol in the UK that when private users, so household users, consumers use pesticides, they don't do a good job. They don't wear their PPE, they don't spray them according to the labels, they don't store them in safe ways. You know, if you think about it, you see bottles of Roundup in sheds next to children's play equipment and like seeds for carrot seeds and stuff like that, right? We know that they don't do a good job of using these substances, but we don't know how these substances would impact pollinators, and we don't know how they'd impact soils because there hasn't been that research emphasis on them. You can say that they wouldn't be as bad as most farming pesticides because people just don't spray them in as much quantities, but you also got to think that gardens are really, really good refuges for wildlife and for pollinators in particular. You know, there's a lot of flowers in gardens, there's a lot of deadwood, there's a lot of like nice habitats for insects and stuff there. So they should really be refuges within cities for insects and for wildlife, and spraying pesticides out in that area with untrained, badly done sprays isn't going to be a good thing for them. But no, we don't have scientific evidence on that at all.
Have you any other quick question there, Mike, that you wanted to?
It was just a comment here. I suppose again, it looks like it's coming from a farmer. A comment here about your presentation and the picture you have of an orchard blast sprayer spraying in the field, and it might be as they said, this is inconceivable. This would never occur because it wouldn't be allowed. And I suppose for the audiences out there, it's probably maybe not the impression, certainly not the right impression, but you might describe maybe how those sprays would, you know, what was done or recorded in terms of the repair.
So this is the feature of the fact that the tool that scientists use to create graphics doesn't have a good image of a tractor mounted boom sprayer, essentially. So we use an air blast sprayer to convey the idea that it is a tractor spraying pesticides. Yes, it is true that air blast sprayers aren't used to spray oilseed rape crops. I didn't produce that graphic myself. It is mostly tractor mounted boom sprayers used in Ireland. So the things that go on the back of tractors or are towed by tractors. It's not aerial application like you get in the States, and it's not these massive, humongous boom sprayers that are used in the States as well with 60-meter long booms. It's mostly tractor mounted boom sprayers that you see here in Ireland.
Specifically, obviously I have a bit of knowledge on it, but specifically maybe half a meter above the crop, with specific nozzle technology to reduce the drift as much as possible, because essentially farmers don't want to be spending money and letting it off somewhere else. They want it to be very targeted where they can.
Yeah, agree.
Okay.
Just one final, sorry, Michael. Go on, you go ahead. You go ahead.
There's a question here around bees in greenhouses and tunnel systems, and any studies on those around pesticides?
So when bees are used in polytunnels and greenhouses, it's typically imported species of bee, or not species, it's typically imported boxes of bees. So there's some factories in Belgium that produce the type of bee I work on, buff-tailed bumblebee, and they are brought into greenhouses or polytunnels, and they're let loose in the polytunnel, and then they're allowed to forage there. And then after that pollination has been done, they are put in the freezer, because we don't want to be releasing them into the wild, because they have, Belgian DNA, and we don't really want that mixing in, and they've got different parasites and stuff. We don't want that mixing with the wider environment. So in terms of the impacts of pesticides on them, I don't know if there has been research done on it, but broadly speaking, it's not that important, simply because those bees are going to die anyway, and we actively don't want those bees making their way out into the wider environment. We do know that bees do come into greenhouses sometimes to forage, but that's a relatively minor sort of amount of pesticide exposure that bees are going to be facing. And also there's not like a very large horticultural sector here in Ireland. So it's a relatively small issue here for the specific context we're talking about.
I suppose it's just worth saying as a final comment on it, certainly commercially, in as much as I know about commercial production in glasshouses, they tend to be almost organic anyway, and the bees are the control because it's a closed-in environment, whereas maybe the person at home at the greenhouse that's open either end, it's a very different situation.
Oh yes, for personal greenhouses, yeah. People shouldn't. I would really encourage you, if you have an allotment in a greenhouse, not to be spraying pesticides to control diseases on your allotment crops and stuff. Like, leave it to the professionals to do it and follow the rules. Like, if you're worried about getting pesticide residues in your food, don't use pesticides in your allotment and greenhouses. Like, leave it to people who have done the full training mechanism and are subjected to inspections by DAFM and the like. Yeah.
Gentlemen, sorry, we're going to have to call a halt. Edward, thank you very, very much for that presentation. I mean, we had a huge audience, and you always know on these webinars, when you have a huge audience right to the end, people are interested. So thanks very, very much for the presentation. Michael, thank you again for coming on. You added hugely to the debate this morning. And I think it was well worth you coming on with us. Thanks again, Michael, for joining us.
Having us.
Before I finish, I just want to mention on next Thursday is World Wetlands Day. Now, we've got a lot of wetlands in Ireland from both an ecology, they serve a huge ecological purpose, and as well as a carbon purpose. But next week, Thursday, February the 2nd, is World Wetlands Day. And to mark that, our webinar on Friday is going to be looking at valuing wetlands under Ramsar. And we have three people who will be contributing to the debate. We have Professor Paul Johnson, who is the Adjunct Professor of Environmental Engineering, again from Trinity College Dublin. Karen Dubsky, who is a coastal ecologist with Coastwatch, and our own Dr. Catherine Keena, who is a countrywide management specialist with us. A lot of the events for the World Wetlands Day are available on irishwetlands.ie, so I'd encourage you to go to that site and look at other events that are specifically on the day. But hopefully we'll be marking the day ourselves on next Friday, so I hope as many of you as possible could join us for that. I'd also just like to mention our partners, Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland, SkillNet, and the National Rural Network, who help us to produce this webinar and contribute to its content weekly. And finally, I would just like to mention Yvonne Maher, who presses all the buttons and does all the technical stuff in the background to keep the show on the road. So until next week, I hope you have a very enjoyable weekend and safe week. And hopefully as many of you as possible will join us again next week on our journey with environmental sustainability. So thank you all very much for joining us, and see you all again next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Edward.